We're not out there fighting anything other than crime.
We see stuff that nobody should have to see.
Put your hands back! Hands it back! Hands it back! Go!
Get out of it, Mel. Get out of it! Get out of it!
Don't move! Don't move!
George 31, erect out.
Don't go!
Put it in paper.
You're going to jail. Where else do you think you're going?
You're listening to The Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide. Volume 2 of The Beat. Volume 1, of course, was Gary Mullins out of the Cleveland Police. And in that introduction, he's the one that's shouting, "Get on it, Mel, get on it, Mel," which is in my top 5 of favorite episodes of Cops all time. What a clip. And hopefully get Gary back on the show soon for a part 2, as we discussed off the air. But with that, we welcome you to episode 259 of the Mike the New Haven podcast. Like I said, volume 2 of this new mini-series that we launched recently called The Beat, where I'm trying to expand now, interview more police officers and firefighters from around the country. Our guest tonight is New York centric. I do a lot of NYPD interviews on the police side, and I'll continue to, but there's other agencies getting it done within New York State. And he can certainly attest to that throughout his career in both Yonkers and currently the MTA Police. If you haven't checked out the previous episode, that was certainly a lot of fun. Amy Freeze from Fox Weather. We mix it up here on the show. Amy, a longtime veteran of WABC, different markets along the way, Chicago, just to name a few, Philadelphia as well. And she was a pleasure to talk to. So a couple sponsors to take care of. One of them, of course, is kind of, I joke, an unofficial sponsor because it is my consulting company. And then Joe Murray. But first, of course, my company. Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guy? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company. Keywords there being reasonable price in case you need me. You know who else is reasonable? Joe Murray. If you're ever caught on the wrong end of the law, call Joe Murray. Joe's a retired NYPD police officer turned criminal defense attorney. With 15 years of experience in the NYPD from 1987 until 2002, he parlayed a successful career in the NYPD into an equally successful career as a criminal defense attorney. His website is jmurray-law.com, where you can reach him at 646-838-1702, or just email him at joe@jmurray-law.com. Special thanks to Joe, of course. Now, sponsors taken care of. My next guest has enjoyed a varied 3-decade career in New York law enforcement, first with the NYPD, originally from 1992 until 1994 on the beat in Harlem, which we'll talk about. Then in 1994, makes the transfer on over to the Yonkers Police Department, where he stayed for 28 years, rose through the ranks, became its commissioner from 2019 up until last year. Took a short break after 28 years there, and then he's still going strong because currently, since June of last year, he's been the chief of the MTA Police, which covers both the state of New York, certain portions of the state of New York, including New York City, and up here, certain portions of the state of Connecticut. And that, for this volume 2 of The Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide, is current MTA Police Chief John Mueller. John, welcome. How are you? Good to see you.
Great to see you, Mike. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So first things first, as I ask every guest, where did you grow up?
I grew up in the city of Yonkers. I attended Christ the King grade school on North Broadway. Unfortunately, the school's not still there, but the church is there. My parents go there. That's their home church. And then I moved my family when our kids started getting ready for school. We moved up to Pleasantville, New York, but born and raised in Yonkers.
Family on the job?
No. My dad was a New York City, Yonkers firefighter. My brother is a retired Yonkers detective, and that's about it. You know, it's my brother and I. My father sometimes says, jokingly, the rivalry between the police and fire. He doesn't know what he did wrong. We both became police officers. He was a firefighter, but I think everybody finds their level, and it's I couldn't be happier with my career choice.
Oh, you should be. You should be. And for those of you in the live chat, whether it be on YouTube or LinkedIn, well, specifically for those of you on YouTube, if you want to contribute in the super chat, forgot to mention, it is there. So were you one of those individuals that took all the tests, or when the time came, did you just take the police test?
I took all the tests, and that was something I think it's what a lot of parents that are civil servants do. And my father told me, just take them all. Because the idea of taking all the exams just gets you better at it. So you can take the Port Authority Police, you can take the NYPD, Yonkers, the Yonkers Fire, New York City Fire. If you're interested in a career of public service, that's usually the best way to go, to take them all. You can always say, what I tell young people that are interested in either profession is you can always turn the job down. But if you don't take the exam and sign up for it and then take it, you're not going to be able to be called, and you don't know how you're going to feel 2 years from now when they finally reach out to you. So it's just a free Saturday, and anybody who's even slightly interested should make use of that.
No, of course, and it's a great. So many guys have told me on both sides, PD and FD, you're never going to get rich being a police officer or being a firefighter, but you'll be able to take care of yourself and take care of your family. And that stability is something that it's not easy to come by in every job, but those are the fields, right? Working for the city, whatever city that might be or town that might be, that give you that stability. So NYPD calls you in 1992. What an opportunity! And this is during Ray Kelly's first stint as police commissioner. He had just come in. So this is the safe street, safer city era. You're coming in during a time when people are fed up with crime. They want something done about it. Something is being done about it. And tell me what that academy was like in a time when, as I've covered before, not just one police department in New York City. This is 3 years before the merge. There's three.
Yeah, it was a really interesting time, and you nailed it. We were in, there's ebbs and flows of crime and different things like that, and as time goes through history, and at that time, people were really fed up with crime, and so at the time, it was Mayor David Dinkins created a Safe Street, Safe City. I think there was some kind of a surcharge where he was able to get revenue and get the blessing of the city council, and they started hiring massive classes. So when I was getting hired, it's kind of a thing where, you see a guy and like, oh, you were Safe Street, Safe City too. It's probably from 1990, 1991 and like 1993, where they hired. I believe, and I could be wrong because it's a long time ago, Mike, I believe my academy class was 2,600 people, which is a giant class. There were 3 platoons, A, B, and C. So one worked 4 to 12, one worked 8 to 4. The other one was off and just kept rotating. But it was a great experience. And as I mentioned, or you and I were talking before we went live, at the time, there were 3 police departments. The merger was later the brainchild of Commissioner Bill Bratton. And at that time, there were, at least for me, there were three piles of cards as you walked in, and you had to decide what agency you wanted to take. So the NYPD were white cards, the transit I believe were orange, and I believe that housing was yellow. And so I decided to pick white. So I took the NYPD. That there was enough of those cards available. So I took that, and then I went into the academy.
Right. And again, this is during a time when cops are being encouraged to be a lot more proactive. Not to say that they weren't being encouraged to do so beforehand in the 80s. It was just a time when, enough was enough, and it had reached a fever pitch. So during that academy, rather, if you're going to housing or transit or the NYPD, the mission is the same. Go out there, make collars, take preventative measures as much as you can on the beat. What are some of the key lessons you learned that most stick with you, I should say, to this day from that time in the academy?
I think, number one, they were big on corruption, and they were very, very big on corruption. If you remember, there was a Michael Dowd scandal at the time. Yeah. And so that was like front and center of what we went through. They were probably just starting to learn how to do role plays, which were very interesting. It was very militaristic. It was, you learned how to march, you learned how to, stand at attention and things like that. And the disciplines were broken down into 3 disciplines: social science, police science, and law. And of course, you had PT. And I think that curriculum still applies. Probably not the lessons themselves, but the overall. There's a social science component to policing. There's a law component to policing, and there's a police science component to policing. And I think that still endures in the New York City Police Academy. At the time, we were down at on 20th Street, East 20th Street, which I don't know if it was really built to be a police academy, but it worked. And it's some of the memories. I almost remember I probably, if I really think hard, I can remember every single person in that academy class because it's the most impactful thing. That first 6 months where you're there and you don't know anything and everything is new and you want to make sure you do well and you're afraid of messing up and all this other stuff. But it was, I look back very fondly on that time. I really had a great time. You have a tendency to really bond with the people that are in your company. My company was 9279, and I still remember to this day how how great those people were, and I remember my instructors too.
Of course, I think is that academy by One Truck.
Yes, it is. I think it's right across the street, actually. Mike, you know everything about the NYPD, obviously.
Because I remember a friend of mine, Paulie Perricone, who was in One Truck for the majority of the 90s. He later went to the bomb squad and retired out of there, saying that it was not uncommon for recruits and people that lived in that area to see a One Truck cop practicing rappelling on the side of the building. So that's why that memory came to mind. And you get out, and then, of course, there's how you're taught in the academy, and then there's the street. And quick shout out to a couple of people tuning in so far. Pat Pogan, retired NYPD Emergency Service Unit Detective Truck 2, and Ray Ruiz, also the Emergency Service Unit, worked in Trucks 2, 3, and 4. Thanks, guys, both for tuning in thus far, and to the rest of you as well. So, like I was saying, there's the way you do it in the academy, or the way you're instructed, and then there's the street. You're going to have that salty veteran cop in the precinct saying, essentially, not maybe in these words, forget about that book, kid. This is how it's done. And the 2-8 was one of those precincts because Harlem, you talk about ebbs and flows. Some neighborhoods, beautiful brownstones, ritzy-ditzy, rich people live in there. Other areas, like a war zone, especially in the early 90s. What was the 2-8 like, and who would you say were those senior salty cops that taught you how it was done on the street, so to speak?
Well, I'll tell you, my commanding officer had like an indelible impression on me to this day, and that was Captain Bill Morange. And I believe he went on, obviously, to be a 3-star chief. He ended up doing the job I do now, where he was the chief of the MTA. He was even actually higher. He was the security vice president for security, which now, the way the MTA Police Department is designed, it falls under the Department of Security. But I believe at the time, Bill Morange was in charge of everything, and he was just a fantastic guy. When you back then, I say, you didn't always have a personable commanding officer. And what really made an impression on me about how you could be with the community was how streams of people would come in off the street and just go right into his office. And he just seemed to get along with everybody. And he was very down to earth. He's very easy to talk to. He treated us all with respect, but he expected us to do our jobs. And he really had a very positive impression on me.
What was the earliest moment, once you get off the foot post, or even it could have occurred on the foot post before you got into a sector car, where you said, wow, that was a rush and I'm really glad I came on this job? Could have been an uplifting call, could have been a dangerous moment that thankfully turned out okay. What was that early moment where you said to yourself, man, I'm in it now?
It's hard to think back then, but I think a lot of the gun runs were what you're deciding. Like, it was just like they came in all the time, and you'd have competing drug dealers calling on each other where they would call, give a description. We would go to that particular corner. The description would be spot on. Obviously, the guy was not carrying a gun, but it would disrupt maybe his corner of drug dealing for that particular moment in time, or maybe for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes. And that was constant. But just the way the radio crackled, and it was job after job after job, running from job to job. If you remember, and this is another tribute to the work that Bill Bratton did. At that time in 91 or 92, I believe there was probably around over 2,000 homicides a year.
Yep.
For the city for the entire year. And, as Mike Bloomberg left New York City as mayor, there were close to 300, which, if you think about how miraculous that is, I mean, to go from 2,000 to 300. I mean, think about, because I always tell people, like, as much as, you worry about murders, what you really need to focus on is shootings, because the murder rate can fluctuate, but shootings are what really, where if you're doing the right thing with crime, because it's hard to explain. It's hard to measure, but like, think about 1975, if someone was shot. You don't have EMS as quick as they are now. You don't have 911. You don't have advanced life support. It may take longer for emergency services people to get there for you. So people may have died back then that are not dying now. We're saving so many people. You go to Jacoby, I mean, it's like that's a level 1 trauma center where they save people. If they come in with a heartbeat, a lot of times they get saved. I don't think that was the case in the 70s and the 80s where it was as easy to save people. So shootings is what you always want to measure, because that will tell you the real story. Because like I said, we save a lot more people now, but the shootings are what you have to watch.
Of course. And I had the good fortune to interview Howard Safer last summer, and I really enjoyed that interview. And he was talking about when he first came in to the NYPD as their commissioner in 1996 after his stint as fire commissioner. He was saying, listen, shootings, where those that are shot do not die, are just homicides with bad aim. And part of it is tongue in cheek and it's humorous to a degree, but he's right. If you track the shootings, which is something Kelly was doing, Bratton was certainly doing, and he ended up doing Safer, that is when he came in as PC in the spring of 1996, you can really stifle a lot of future homicides, because a lot of police work is not just action in the moment, as you can attest to in your leadership experience over the years. It's prevention too. Prevent it before it becomes a homicide or even a shooting.
Without a doubt. I mean, think about it in terms of the other thing I say all the time is like the havoc that shootings cause. You might not have a homicide, but you think about all the people that are paralyzed, all the people that are in comas, families that are devastated because their loved ones are in wheelchairs.
Yeah.
Bullets going through windows and everything else. There may not result in a murder, but there's absolute carnage that comes from all shootings.
Mm-hmm. Of course. Talking with current MTA Police Chief John Mueller. This is Volume 2 of the Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide. Happy to have the Chief on board tonight. So with that being said, 1994 comes around, and it seems like you're having a great time in the NYPD, but then there's the chance to work for your hometown. And I imagine, and you tell me if I'm wrong, was that a tough moment for you when, on one hand, man, I got this great gig in the 2-8, I'm in a great department, this is right when Bratton's coming into for the first time in 1994's PC and Broken Windows is going into full effect. But on the other hand, like I said, it's a golden opportunity. Was it bittersweet, or was it a lot easier than I'm making it out to be?
Totally bittersweet. Like when I made the judgment call, Yonkers paid a lot more. Both jobs were fantastic. New York City was exciting, and I was 24 years old. I didn't know if I made the right decision. I enjoyed both jobs, but at the time, what do you know when you're 24 years old and you just got on this job? It's hard to weigh, whether you're making the right choice or not. It worked out for me. I would have hoped it would work out for me had I remained in the NYPD, but both jobs were fantastic. Yonkers paid a little more. But the NYPD was absolutely rife with opportunity, all kinds of different specialized units, all kinds of different things. You're in the greatest police department in the world. And so it was bittersweet, and you're spot on. It was not easy, to make that decision.
So you're rolling in with about 2 years experience at the time. Again, you're still young on the job. You're only 24 years old at the time, as you just finished mentioning. Did they have to put you back in their academy class, or how did that process work?
They did. I didn't, because the New York City Police Academy is accredited with New York State. I didn't have to go through the full 6 months, but Yonkers had a minor introductory academy. Maybe it lasted about a month, where you're trying to align yourself with the way they do business, their policies and procedures, their radio codes, how they do business in general. It's similar, but it's not exactly the same. So, they want to make sure that you learn how Yonkers does it. And that's what that time period was for.
Now, this is an interesting moment in not just your career, but your life. So 1994 and 1995, here you are now with about 3 years of experience in law enforcement. You're working in your hometown, but you're working for a new police department, and you're acclimating to how they do things as opposed to the NYPD's way of doing things. Does the fact that you grew up in the city, did that make it a lot easier to learn how things are done in Yonkers as far as policing goes?
Yeah, in some ways it was. I mean, I just, Yonkers is it's the third largest city in New York State. It's a wonderful place. And a lot of people say big city, but small town. Everybody knows each other.
Yeah.
It's probably now, I would say, after the 2020 census review, was probably about 220,000 people. But you kind of know everybody, and there's a lot of people that joined the Yonkers Police Department, and the Yonkers Fire Department, and the Yonkers Department of Public Works that went to Yonkers schools, like I did. So, you kind of come in knowing a lot of people like that, and you understand, the community pretty well. So that transition was pretty easy.
I imagine. I imagine. At this time, listen, whatever, and this is no knock on the surrounding areas. It's they give and take from each other. But whatever New York City is doing naturally kind of fluctuates to the outer boroughs or Suffolk County, Nassau County. And I imagine the same thing was true for Yonkers, to where, like I said earlier, broken windows is in full effect, and there's a major turnaround, a true renaissance in the five boroughs happening. You can kind of count Yonkers as a sixth borough, given its proximity to the Bronx and the fact so many people commute back and forth from Yonkers into the city and vice versa. Were you feeling the effects of broken windows at that time too in Yonkers?
Well, I was always like a student of policing. I just loved to read, and I was just so excited about what Commissioner Bratton was doing in New York City, with Jack Maple and John Timoney and Lou Anamone. All of those guys were like, they just completely turned policing on its head in a very, very positive way. I don't, and I can say that because even though I was relatively new in the NYPD, Ray Kelly was still there, Commissioner Kelly, and David Dinkins. But when Giuliani came in, I moved on to Yonkers, and then Giuliani, as we know, hired Bill Bratton, and the rest was history. But Yonkers did not embrace that initial way that we could really think about how to solve crime, how to be thoughtful about crime strategies, how to really, reduce crime. There was somewhat of an attitude by a lot of, upper level police officers, like, it is what it is, respond to it, deal with it, and we'll wait for the next one. I think Bill Bratton with Jack Maple and John Mueller and those other guys I named, they came in and they're like, no, we can knock crime down. So they were at the forefront of this kind of revolution that turned our profession into a really effective, not always perfect, but a much, much far more effective, efficient operation than it had been in the past.
No, for sure. For sure. Now, at that time, much like I asked you about getting into 2-8, you get into Yonkers and you're working with, I imagine, senior officers that have a lot of time on. Now, in any job, there's two types of old timers. There are some that are go-getters that still love the job and want to teach. And there are some, because they're getting closer to retirement, that maybe take it easier and don't push as much because they're getting closer to retirement. But in the case of, you going into the Yonkers PD at that time, if you were with a go-getter, somebody that had 20, 25 years on and was salty, but not in a bad way, they wanted to share that knowledge, what were they sharing with you, and what are some of the key lessons, if any, that you picked up from them, directly or indirectly?
I think the thing that I loved the most was, I talk to young officers now about, I say, the difference between the words and music. And the words is understanding tactics and understanding, policy, and knowing, the right way to do things, understanding the law, how to apply the law. The music is more how to talk to people, how to get to yes when you're interacting with community members and people that are in a bad way, maybe mental health crisis. That's what I love from the senior guys the most, the ones that were really good. They just knew how to talk to people. And you learn, especially when you don't have a partner and you're bouncing around because no one knows who you are, you get a lot of different types of personalities, types of approaches. And I kind of like, it settled on me later on. I probably didn't know it at the time, but like, would you like to go around for 8 hours and be sick to your stomach and arguing with everybody all day? Or would you like to have a good time, laugh, not have to get things to a fever pitch, not to have to escalate things? And it just makes things a lot easier. So I really picked up on senior guys, knowing how to talk to people. They were very confident in their own skin. They're very comfortable with, they just knew the job. So they didn't have to put on any airs. They didn't have to act tough. They didn't have to, put on a show. It was just, they're just very, very smooth. And it goes back to what I said earlier. They were great musicians. They understood music.
And you can liken it to being a composer too, right? Knowing when to raise the tempo, knowing when to lower it. That's key in policing, because how you talk to someone. I was having this conversation the other day with my friend Keith Gallagher, who's currently lieutenant in emergency service in the NYPD. Even if you're dressed up, and I found this point interesting, he was saying, even if he comes in dressed up in tactical gear, the ballistic shield, the helmet, the vest, the whole 9 yards, he says, in his words, he's coming in on a 1. You come in on a level 10. Now, there's instances where it's necessary. If there's imminent threat to life, then yes, obviously that goes out the window. But if you can come in on a 1, it can really dictate how that situation is going to go. And you admire those that can walk that line and not only know how to walk it themselves, but teach others to do it too. Now, speaking of teaching others, right, there's that rank ascension portion of your career. Coming on to Yonkers now, where, okay, this is where I'm going to be for the next 20, 25 years or so. When you first got on, was that thought in your head, or was it something that gradually came to you? Maybe I should study for sergeant. Maybe I should try to move on up.
Yeah, I think at the time I was starting to get interested in education. I like the idea of, I think a lot of cops, sometimes some of the things they see, they get frustrated, understandably so. And, it turns into this language of somebody ought to, or they better, or they should, right? And you realize pretty early on, well, if I really want those things to happen, they're going to have to start with me and people like me. So we have to take these exams. We have to study for them so that we can affect change in the way we think we want to. You can't, can constantly complain about this unless you want to jump in and actually take that leap. So that's kind of one of the things that motivated me.
Interesting. Real quick note on it. Like I said earlier, Yonkers is a 6th borough, and you were, of course, by 2001, had 7 years in Yonkers, and then there's that NYPD connection, of course, from your time there in 1992, from 1992, I should say, until 1994 when 9/11 hit. And Yonkers was tremendously helpful in the days and weeks and months afterwards, setting down personnel, particularly from your ESU up there. But being a police officer so close to the city during that time, and maybe even knowing some of the officers from the NYPD who perished, tell me about that time of your career.
Yeah, in Yonkers, we lost a number of members of service afterwards because of cancer. And I will say one of the interesting assignments I had when I first got on the NYPD is I was at the first bombing of the World Trade Center in the parking garage.
Yes,
I was down there for about a month. It was a giant hole, and they just would fly you down there, and you just have to stand there on a post. I believe it was like in February. It was cold.
Yeah, it was.
And that was probably February '93. But yeah, I mean, listen, it hits home in so many different ways. So many people were affected by 9/11. My wife of almost 30 years now, she got out. She was not in the World Trade Center, but she was in Manhattan that day working in her job, and she had to get out like everybody else got out. But there's nothing short of absolute heroism between FDNY, NYPD, and the outpouring of support by the public, outside agencies, outside police departments like Yonkers. Just it was a horrible time, but it really also showed how galvanized we could become as a nation after that happened. I'll never forget watching George Bush stand on top of the pile, talking about how we would visit the people that were responsible for this. It really just made everybody feel very close to each other.
It reminds me of a story a month later. As you know, he threw out the first pitch at Game 3 of the World Series between the Yankees and Diamondbacks, and he's warming up, and there's security. Security's tight as it is at Yankee Stadium, but it was extra tighter given the circumstances of the time and given the fact that even without that event, it's the president. So, you got to tighten things up times 10. And as he's warming up, Derek Jeter's getting ready on the other side, and Derek Jeter looks over at President Bush and says, "Don't bounce it, they'll boo you." He goes out there and he throws a strike. And, people often look back at that moment too. Yankees went on to win that game 2-1 behind a really good outing from Roger Clemens. So going back to your career, now making sergeant, you're in that unique position where now I have to do some direct teaching. And now I have to be in a supervisory role where even if there's cops on this shift that have a long time on the job, I'm not going to tell them how to do the job, but I have to make sure that they're safe. And that's not an easy transition. Anything else after that becomes easier, but that first rank ascension is always the hardest. What was it for you that made that process easy with time? And when was the moment you finally felt comfortable in your role as a supervisor?
Wow, that's a great question. It is absolutely the hardest change, because one minute you're with the guys, you're one of the guys, and the next minute you're responsible for the guys. And I've heard some people call it, are you going to make the great change or the great compromise? And it's not easy. And I look back on my time as a new sergeant. it really was a challenge. I think my watershed moment was an incident that occurred on Elliott Avenue in Yonkers, and there had been some kind of a civil disturbance. We had to go there to break up a fight in the street. A lot of people out in the street. It was hot that night, and we dispersed the crowd. We made a few arrests, and then we got called back because they were dragging furniture into the middle of the street and setting it on fire. And so the fire department went, and then they had gotten there first, and they were throwing stuff at the fire department. And so they called for police backup. I get there, I'm in a corner, and someone had thrown a full gallon of paint 5 stories off of the roof, and it landed in my passenger seat. Like, I mean, the guy who threw this, there's no way he could have ever done it again. Like, the odds of the angle being that perfect, I thought I got shot. I mean, the glass, because of the velocity of something that heavy coming up from 5 stories, like, it vaporized the glass. The glass was like just gone. It would have killed or paralyzed if I had someone in the passenger seat. It landed right on the seat. The reason why I say it was my watershed moment was, I'm thinking to myself, all right, the crowd is more aggressive. They just, they almost killed me with the paint can. Do I go back to the precinct to clean up, or do I go out there and I start supervising our people and really, getting this block under control? And I made the choice to go back out there with my officers and clear the block. We ended up making like 11 arrests. There was some controversy, where there was film, nothing that officers did poorly, but, it was a controversial day. I mean, I ended up calling in helicopter assistance from the Westchester County Police Department and, additional units. Obviously, we stabilized the area. We cleaned everything up. We put the fire out. And that was my watershed moment. Like, am I going to take charge here? Am I going to do what I have to do as a sergeant, or am I kind of just going to let this go? And that one moment really gave me a lot of confidence.
I can imagine, because naturally your men and your women, they're looking at you to see what you're going to do. They know you as a patrol officer. They don't know you yet as a supervisor. And some people who are great patrol officers don't always make the best supervisors. It's not as easy a transition as you think, which is why I wanted to ask you that question. But so if they see that you generally speaking, not you specifically, are tentative, they're going to think, he might not have my back when it's going to hit the fan. But if they see what you demonstrated that night, it tells you, all right, I know if it hits the fan, he's not going to wince. He's not going to shrink away in the moment. He'll be right beside me if the situation calls for it. And not only does that build confidence, it builds trust, it builds a great rapport, it builds further character in the police department, and it sets the tone for how a police department's going to operate. If you have hard-charging supervisors when it's necessary to, your cops are going to be motivated to do the same.
Absolutely. It's a true statement. And when I think back to that moment, it's not just about that moment. Like you said, you're honing your skills. And the truth is, some people learn quicker than others. So it's never an all or nothing situation. A lot of times it's a blend. Like, some people just do things better. There are guys that go into emergency services just because they're very good with their hands. Like, there's so many great things that, like, emergency services cops do, that they're builders, they're innovators, they're engineers in some ways. Then there's detectives. They do a different responsibility, and the greatest detectives aren't always the best cops. The best cops aren't always the best ESU guys. The best supervisors aren't always the best police officers, and vice versa. So you kind of have to find your own spot. That night I was never so proud. My family, we revere the United States military, but in particular the United States Marines, because my dad was a Marine. And one of the cops that night came up to me, who was a former, well, you're never a former Marine, but he was a Marine and a Yonkers police officer. He said, he goes, if you were in the Marines right now, you would have got a field promotion. And what I found out later about that incident was, like, if a Marine does super well at that moment in time in a critical incident like this, you get a field promotion. So I was very proud of that they said that. But I think what happens is you really have to immerse yourself, and it doesn't come easy when you want to be as a new supervisor. Like, you're going to have bumps in the road. People are going to challenge you. You'll have senior guys that don't want to give you a hard time, and everyone is watching to see how you're gonna manage it all. So it's that's one of the things I can believe now very strongly in standing up and supporting our new sergeants. We sit down with them uh, every single time they get promoted. We're promoting like crazy in the MTA now because they had a little bit of a slowdown in promotions. And we sit down with them. We talk about all the things that I think will make them good supervisors. And it's a two-way conversation. I think it's very healthy.
Oh, of course, you want to get that dialogue going and see where their head's at and to quell any concerns because it's new for everyone, not just the officers, but also for the supervisor too. And it's a little awkward at first, like with anything new in life. So the best way to mitigate that process, like you said, is by that direct communication. Now, as a lieutenant, you got to be in the intelligence unit for a brief period of time, supervising some investigations there. Now, nowadays, of course, in the post 9/11 landscape, people think of intelligence and immediately go to counterterrorism. Is that part of it? Yes. But there's also field intelligence into drug dealers, into petty crimes, whatever it is. So, supervising a unit like that, or at least having a hand, if not directly supervising in investigations of that nature, how valuable is that balancing act between deciphering what's real, what's a really good tip? What maybe isn't, somebody's trying to do the right thing, or like you said earlier, right from your NYPD years, it's drug dealers that are competing with each other, and also being able to build rapport with potential CIs.
Yeah, that's very important. I mean, I love the time I was in the Special Investigations Unit. We that's when we really started developing great relationship with outside agencies like the ATF, the Secret Service, the FBI, NYPD Intel. The list goes on and on about how many people we worked with, but it was all about just and you're lucky there because normally you get detectives that are already experienced. They already have worked in general assignment. They've worked cases before, so that's very helpful too. But that was a good time and interesting because um, in a small place like Yonkers, are relatively small compared to the NYPD, you were there doing all kinds of things, dignitary protection. We had when the Pope came in 2007, we played a major role in it when the Pope came to St. Joseph Seminary. So you get a lot of different experience, get to meet a lot of different people, make a lot of contacts, make a lot of friends, and in the end, that helps your agency and helps other agencies because now you have people that you can call.
Yeah, and that's important. Any type of long-term investigation specifically, that's very important. You need friends in any field, but especially in the first responder field. And it's amazing what the NYPD Intelligence Bureau can do, and also the neighboring partners. When I had John Mueller on a couple of years ago for what was my 100th episode, he talked about that. He didn't just sing the praises of his guys and girls; he sung the praises of those adjacent agencies, both locally and federally. It's a partnership because, unfortunately, you see it. The bad guys are working in tandem; they don't care. There's no price on what they can do, and nothing that they can't handle together. Unfortunately, when they're using their powers for evil. But sometimes, and this has been a problem in the past, the good guys aren't talking to each other, but now they are. And when you remove those barriers, who knows what can get done in the right ways, in the right context.
Yeah, I mean, I think 9/11 was the perfect example of that, where there was communication breakdowns and there was intel silos where certain groups had certain things and other groups had other things and we weren't sharing. I think we've come a long way with that. I think we've recognized that, this is more important. The mission and keeping people safe and doing it right is more important than getting credit or hiding information from each other. At the end of the day, what do we want to do? We want to keep people safe. And the way you keep people safe is using every avenue you can to get there. And a huge part of that is working with other agencies. And it doesn't necessarily have to be law enforcement agencies either. There's tons of agencies that you can work with that, aren't even law enforcement, but they're extremely, extremely helpful.
No, of course. Making captain. Now, it's an interesting position in that, and this is sometimes the drawback as you ascend further in the ranks. And again, speaking generally, you're less and less involved to a capacity in the field. And that's tough for some that like to be out in the field. I remember watching an episode of Cops they filmed in Buffalo in the mid 90s. It was a rerun where a lieutenant said, I don't want to get promoted to captain. I've declined the promotion quite a few times because if I make captain, I'm not out in the street anymore with the guys. And I always want to be here with the guys. So it's tough because, again, it's a great rank. It's more financial stability, especially if you have a family, but you're not as involved. So balancing that, portion of your career between being involved in the administrative matters of the department, but still making sure you're quote unquote the real police. Tell me about that, because that's another difficult and sometimes hard transition for those in law enforcement.
Well, I think that leads us into like when I became the commanding officer of the 4th Precinct in Yonkers. That was absolutely the best time of my career. I never had so much fun as I did with those guys. They were just fantastic. And what it did because prior to that, I was the union president of the Captains, Lieutenants, and Sergeants Association, which is the supervisory bargaining unit for the Yonkers Police Department superior officers. Prior to that, being in the intel unit, that was, you're kind of sequestered. So going back to the precinct, you get to meet the new cops, the young cops, the cops that are excited about the job. They're excited about each other. They're great to talk to. And that was the best time in my career. I think I had the most fun when I was in the 4th precinct. And that was for a number of reasons. One was, again, is seeing these young cops, how interested and excited they were. And that allowed you to get back out there, because the one thing I learned, and that's really where I developed kind of like my community platform, how we could do things right. I think one of the things we make a mistake is we don't take the time to really sit down and get to know our constituencies. We really, like people say community policing, it's a cliche, but myself and my team really had a great time interacting with the community and solving problems. And the truth is, most people, thank God, aren't usually victims in their entire lives of a violent crime. But everybody gets affected by quality of life. So what we did in the 4th precinct was we focused on quality of life issues, loud radios, illegal dumping, streetlights that were out. And the community just really embraced that philosophy that we were there to fix things. We didn't just say, well, you know what, your streetlight's out, so just call this phone number and they should help you. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but we can't help you. And, what we did was we're like, no, tell us where the streetlight is. We'll get the number off the light pole. We'll go and call our contact in the lighting department in Yonkers and get the light turned on. And Mike, you would not believe the reception you get the next month when you say you're going to do something and then you do it. That's why the way we designed our community meetings was very structured. So what we would say is, first thing we're going to do is talk about everything we said we were going to do last month, and we're going to give everybody updates. So this street light got put on, this street light didn't. It didn't mean that there weren't some projects we were working together with the community that were in transition and we weren't able to finish them yet. They were in process, but you have to do that to show credibility. Too often in some communities, it's not just about discourtesy or brutality or misconduct. Sometimes communities are just unhappy with you because you're not being responsive to them. Like, we have to remember, the communities is our client. We are there to serve them. They're our client. We don't operate in dollars and cents. We operate in community, crime stats. What does crime look like in a given precinct? But it also, how does the community feel about how we're policing? So this 4th precinct experience was just the best experience of my entire career because of those cops and those supervisors I got to work with.
And we talked, of course, and we talked earlier about, of course, that somebody ought to, or I wish somebody would, and that's where it must be really interesting to become the commanding officer of a precinct, where you're that somebody. Now you can do that. You're in a position where you can affect that change, and again, it's a lifetime, right? Even though it's not quite 20 years at this juncture, it's close to it, where all those lessons, all those experiences from your time in the NYPD, from your time to that point in Yonkers, had paved the way for that moment where you're taking all of that, and not only what you should do, but maybe even observing some officers saying, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't do that. And that's what can make you an effective commanding officer.
Yeah, you got to have your finger on the pulse. You got to know everybody. And it's something that I started to learn at that time, and I still, work on it today, is that sometimes when you have 30 years on a job, you think that the world doesn't change. You think that whatever you think is the way the world is. And if you want to be an effective commanding officer, you want to be effective chief, you want to be an effective manager, leader, supervisor, whatever, you have to meet your people on their level. There's only one chief. There's only one commanding officer. There are hundreds of cops or thousands of cops in a given agency. Most of the time, they're going to be younger. And so you have to think about how they respond. How are you communicating with them? How do they respond to criticism? How do they respond to praise? How do they learn? Whatever worked for me doesn't matter. There's only one of me. I have to figure out what flips their switches and what they respond to, and then leverage that, because they are in a better situation to manage the community today than anybody, in my era. And it's the same, what I say all the time, I kind of laugh, because I think almost like there's this this attitude, like with the 5-year cop, the salty cop, like, oh, this job is going down the tubes. And someone mentioned that to me one time. I probably had over 20 years for sure. And I said, after the Marines and the United States military stormed Iwo Jima, they were in Iwo Jima, and they came back after World War II to, wherever they lived, and they became police officers. I'll bet you the guys in the precinct at that time said, oh, this job is over. But it's never over. It's just over for you when you have 20 years on, in terms of what your reality is. Like, you really have to be more attentive to who they are, how they learn, how they respond, and how to communicate with them than it is about what you think.
Mm-hmm. And your attitude can affect them, because if you're negative, well, then they're going to be negative. But if you're positive, vice versa. And of course, that's the beauty of being in that role, where some do well with it, others don't. Obviously, you've done quite well with it.
And just one thing, Mike, I wanted to mention, that's why I really believe very strongly in procedural justice. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a tried and tested strategy with the community where there are 4 pillars. One pillar that's really kind of off to the side is officer health and wellness, but the other 3 are very, very relevant to what we do with the community. And it is, number 1, are we giving the community a voice? Are we allowing them to tell us how they feel and explain whatever situation you're going into, right? The other thing is, are we being transparent? Are we explaining to them why we're doing what we're doing? A lot of times a simple explanation is all people want or need, and you can get full cooperation that way. And then the third piece is, are we approaching a situation from objectivity as opposed to subjectivity? The reason I bring this up is because there's such a thing also as internal procedural justice. And the idea that if we listen to our cops, we hear them, we give them a voice about, what they're frustrated about, what they're happy about. If we explain why we're doing what we're doing, not just taking this old school way of saying, well, it's good enough for you, it's good enough for me. Do as I say. Don't worry about it. Just do what I tell you. That's not how this generation operates. So you have to be transparent with them and explain why. You have to be able to answer questions from them and not be worried about that. And you have to come from a position of objectivity, because for any commanding officer, really, the name of the game is, am I putting my people out when they leave the precinct, when they leave roll call? Are they in a position to want to serve? Because if they're treated like crap inside a command, inside a precinct, and they're going to go out and they're going to project that treatment onto the public. On the other hand, conversely, if they are treated properly in the precinct, if they are valued, loved, very important, held accountable, because there's got to be guardrails, all those things, they're going to do a better job when they go out and do the public. So I think that's the biggest bridge we can do, is really creating a good environment for our police officers internally, so that they understand when they go out, they will do unto others, as it were.
It's a trickle-down effect, right? It's a trickle-down effect, or a domino effect, or whatever analogy you want to use. And it starts at the top, A fish rots from the head down, I believe is the old saying. But you can counteract that with good leadership. And I love your explanation, because not just in law enforcement or in emergency services, period. You go anywhere. And so many CEOs that have had a lot of success, that have good running companies that employees are highly satisfied working for, that's the key. They just simply treat people with respect. All you have to do is be nice. And some people just can't bring themselves to do it, which I can't understand. And they're baffled when their career's not going well, or when their company's not doing so well. But especially in a field like law enforcement, where, think about what you have to see. You can go, and this was brought up the other day in a post I saw on LinkedIn, you can go from a situation where you're responding to a suicide, and then very next call is a traffic stop, and somebody's giving you attitude because they just did 10, 15 over in the speed limit. And here you are giving them a ticket. You don't know what that officer just endured, and now here they are, to where, is the job stressful? Naturally, there's a lot of pressure. Sometimes there can be some frustrations, like with any job, but it helps if they at least know they have a good command structure that they can count on. And that keeps them coming. That keeps them motivated, keeps them happy. And I love that you mentioned health and wellness too.
Yeah, I think we're doing better with that. I think this generation of police officer is, there is no stigma with mental illness and mental health and mental wellness, where there might have been when I came on the job. There wasn't a lot of talk about that. I think this generation is much more understanding that mental illness is what it is, and it's not unlike if you have to take medication. If there's some kind of deficiency going on, and something, changes, whatever it is you need to be changed, it's not unlike, blood thinner, so you don't have a heart attack. And this generation has been very good organically, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in a bit. The MTA PD has been fantastic. Organically, the officers themselves created a peer support unit trying to understand the long-term effects of trauma, and how we can just make sure people are okay and they're able to talk to someone if they need to. And if it goes beyond that one conversation, can we forward them to resources where they can get help more? And in the end, Mike, it's a fantastic investment because we want people to be well. We want them to be physically well, mentally well, and it's a very, very important aspect of us as far as our business continuity.
Well, last year I interviewed Glenn Klein, who's a retired NYPD Emergency Service Unit police officer, and Glenn was in 10 Truck in Queens, and he talked about, particularly, he had to retire in 2003 because 9/11 had just really worn him down, not only physically but emotionally too. And 10 Truck lost 2 of its members that day, and he likened it to a sponge. When you squeeze the sponge, does most of the water, most of the soap come out? Yes, but not all of it. Some of it's still in you. So how do you deal with that? Who better to understand you and what you're feeling and what you're going through than a fellow first responder? And I think that unfortunately came to a head a few years ago when the NYPD particularly was hit with 10 suicides. And that's the thing. You'd rather, and the fire service is starting to do this as well too, which is important. You'd rather have that firefighter, that police officer talk to you. And even if they break down crying, whatever it is, better for them to talk than for you to have to carry their casket.
Absolutely.
And it's important. And I'm glad that more leadership is understanding of that too, especially as time goes along. And it is becoming less taboo. And I've said this off the air too. There's some societal evolutions that are not good, but that's one of them that is good, that people are talking more and more about that than they were 15, 20, 25 years ago. So moving ahead to when you make chief, at some point before you became commissioner, you were operating as a deputy chief, and you're kind of that go-between, if you will, where you're speaking to a commissioner. You're, of course, having those one-on-one important conversations. You're in a liaison to an effect, but you're also monitoring what's on the street. And it's kind of like a chief of department to a police commissioner, right? Eddie Caban has his chief of department currently, and Jeff Madry. I imagine those back and forth that those two have about procedural matters. So when you're in a high-ranking position, and you're trying to keep that line of communication open, how important was that for you? And what were the specific things you did in that role that helped make sure that morale stayed high and the members felt heard, and also the commissioner felt understood in his message that he was trying to relay?
Yeah, I'll tell you, that was I was the chief of support services for most of the time I was chief. And again, it's not something that a lot of people would seek out. You want to be chief of patrol. You want to be chief of investigative services, chief of detectives. Support services is kind of all the back office stuff, but no less important. When you think about it, everything we do is for the moment when a cop gets sent to a home and they have to solve a problem. When they ring the bell and they go in the house and they solve the problem, everything there. Radios, are the radios working? Are the cars functional? Do they have the right equipment? Do they have the right training? So if anything prepared me to be a police commissioner, it was those two roles. It was commanding officer of the 4th Precinct, and it was chief of support services. And it really does, it's a very rewarding position because you can really all of a sudden do things that you can really help the cops. Like, we were having a terrible time. Most police departments do with their fleet. Like, it's just the nature of, 24/7, the cars are running all the time. They're jumping curbs. You got 15 different people driving them every 3 days. It just, they take a real beating. And one of the things we came up with was we just made a very simple inquiry to Ford. At the time, we had Ford vehicles and said, how much would a warranty cost for a municipal police department to extend the warranty? And they were like, no, it's the same as if you buy it as a resident. I'm like, really? Because obviously people take far better care of their car than they do the police car they drive. And so we then started this whole process, which I still think exists, where it was like an extra $3,000 a vehicle. But what that did was we had the cars longer and they're in better shape. If the transmission dropped, it would take us 6 months to get procurement to pay for a transmission, get it in the shop and everything else. The fact that we had a warranty, it goes right away. They drop in the transmission, the car comes right back. So it's things like that you're doing to make sure. The other thing is, and I think this is very important as for a commanding officer, it's broken windows in commands. Like, if broken windows in policing is very important, right? You take care of little things. Well, as a commanding officer or a chief, you have to do broken windows within a police department. If there is a bathroom and 2 of the 3 urinals are broken and they have garbage bags tied around them, you're not sending a very good message to your personnel that you care about their work environment. If you have 3 computers and 2 of them are broken and no one's fixed them for 3 weeks and there's like a line of people up there trying to write reports, you're not paying attention to them. If the precinct is dirty, if the furniture is old, so the support services piece really allows you to think very critically about how to make the work environment of the police officers better. Another example I had was detention services, where we would do all the processing of the prisoners. We have a Yonkers City jail, so we do hold people overnight, and then we take them to court in the morning. But the bullpen was just a disaster at the time, especially when we're making a lot more arrests than we do now. And the detention officer just simply asked, like, can we have plexiglass? Because all day long, it's like just this high volume yelling and screaming and shouting. Just a little minor thing like that. Like, let's get some plexiglass up. We can still see everybody. We can still hear with.
Your microphone cut out there, Chief.
Oh, I'm sorry. I got you.
As you were saying.
So it's just those little things. You can go out and you can help. You can figure out ways to just make the quality of life of the police officer better. Again, like I said, everything builds to that. You want them to have a good attitude. You want them to be properly trained. You want them to look sharp in terms of uniform. You want them to be knowledgeable about how they do the job. You want them to show empathy, and you want them to be constitutionally accurate. And everything we do from support services standpoint builds to that point. So it gives you an opportunity to really help people.
Oh, of course. And imagine getting yelled at all day, hearing that in your ear all day. You wouldn't blame a cop for going home grumpy after a shift like that, when some EDP or some dissatisfied prisoner that doesn't want to accept the consequences of their action is screaming at them. But a little change like that goes a long way. Save the cop's brain, save his eardrums too.
Yeah, I was a booking lieutenant, so I always had a soft spot for the detention services. I was a booking lieutenant in Yonkers for 3.5 years. So all I did was just sit there and book prisoners, one after the other. And I learned some great de-escalation techniques with that, because, the person may come in to be arrested and feel like they were not treated fairly. Maybe they're angry about a family situation or whatever it is. And it's our job in detention services to get that person to say, how can you and I exist together for the next 24 hours where you're okay and I'm okay? And sometimes it's just very simple acts of kindness where it's like, you know what? Can I get you another sandwich? Would you like 2? It's not, you don't have to have 1 phone call. We'll give you 2 phone calls. We'll give you 3. Want to call your child? Call your child. And, something simple like that, these polite nothings didn't cost us anything, may have, prevented us from having to take a prisoner to the hospital and be on a prisoner watch for, a full day. So it's all about just trying to get through the day and treating people properly. So those things also teach you very well how to manage different situations.
By 2019, of course, you got about 25 years on in the Yonkers Police Department. That's when you become commissioner, and so much has changed from when you first started in 1994 to where things are now. The city's growing, things are humming. This is right before the pandemic. But even then, all that experience and leadership is nothing like that position where you're in charge of everything. And it is, as in most cases with the police commissioner, a civilian position. Even though you are the top cop, it's generally regarded as a civilian position. So when that moment came and you were put in as PC, tell me about the feeling first of exactly that, being told that you were going to run the entire department. And then, of course, game planning for what else you wanted to accomplish now.
It comes back to that very early conversation we had in the podcast where it was like, now we can do things that we think are right for the agency, for the officers, and for the community. It was like, now we understand, like, I'm a big believer. Probably the biggest thing I focused on is I'm a big believer in precision policing. I think that we over incarcerated at one point in the United States and we locked everybody up, and we didn't have to. You have to recognize who your top offenders are, and they're in every crime category, and you have to focus on them. So that philosophy we really pushed hard, and that's the way we were able to drive crime down. That if for 85% of the crimes that are occurred, 10% of the people are doing it. So if you focus on those 10%, you get them in jail. There are consequences for them. You are going to see your crime numbers drop. The easiest way to describe it is take largely from autos, right? Some people would consider it a nuisance crime. My argument is it's not a nuisance crime when someone's scraping by and they have a very small bandwidth of what they can afford with rent and food and all the other incidentals that life requires. And then you get your car window broken. You have to get it fixed. You may lose a day of work when you're taking the car to get the window fixed. And with the precision policing model, the concept is that if you have 30, say there's 30, largely from autos in a precinct in a month, it's not 30 people doing one each. It's one guy doing 20 and then another guy doing 7. And then there's 3 that you can't statistically or analytically figure out where they came from. When those guys are in jail, there are less than 5. When they're out of jail, there's 30 because people just don't, some people commit crimes and some people don't. So you got to focus on them. And what that does, Mike, it also makes it better with the community in terms of you're not stopping everybody unnecessarily because that can be traumatic too. So it's just a real nice way of keeping people safe and also having people feel secure in how you're policing. Very important to have both of those balances.
Mm-hmm. And majority of the people that are living in that community know who the bad actors are. And so there's such a sigh of relief when, yes, finally he's in jail and we're not going to see him for a while. Yes, finally they took him off the street, because it's unfortunately, and this is a common thread, and I remember many an interview with former New York City housing cops that would tell me the same thing. Majority of the people, for example, that live in those housing projects are great, honest, hardworking people who, like you said, some of whom are just scraping by, but you got that 10% and they ruin it for everybody else. And if you let them run amok, it's going to extend. It's broken windows, but in reverse if the criminals start taking control. So it's important
absolutely
to break the pattern.
And listen, I heard a great story from Mayor Adams about this in a recent graduation. We're still currently sending our MTA police officers to the NYPD Academy for their initial 6 month of training. But Mayor Adams said he was a platoon lieutenant and they were in a housing project doing verticals. And one of the young cops was like, you see, Lieutenant, this place is a dump. Look at the people pissing all over the place here. And what Mayor Adams said at the time, he said to the young officer, he said, you better understand something. The rest of the people that live here are as angry as you are about this. They don't want to see this any more than anybody else does. And that's where I think we make huge inroads with the public. We know that forget about what you see on social media. The community and the police support the cops. They want the cops to treat them properly. They want them to protect them. So, that's very important.
Of course. A couple last notes on your time in Yonkers before we get to the MTA. And that is 2020, you get this invisible bullet, of course, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is not easy because, at least, of course, as I've talked about before with those that responded to September 11th, you knew what the situation was. It was contained to one area. And for disastrous as it was, you could at least ascertain how you should and shouldn't respond. This was, like I said, invisible. You don't know how you can deploy your personnel in something like this. There hadn't been something like this in over 100 years. So your 2020 as commissioner in charge of a police department responsible for patrolling a city and protecting a city of over 250,000 people, how stressful was that, and how did you get through that?
It wasn't as stressful as you'd think because I had such great staff, and I had great police officers, and we had a great relationship with the union, and we had a great relationship with the community. So we had built all these foundational pieces that made it better for us to respond. I can tell you a couple of things that we did that other people didn't that I'm very proud of. Just 1 second, Mike. I'm going to just plug in my laptop because I'm running out of battery and I don't want to go dead on you. Okay.
Sure thing. Okay.
Okay.
We'll put you in the back room while you do that. This is, of course, Volume 2 of the Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide. Quick shout out, Pat Pogue and Ray Ruiz. I mentioned you guys earlier. Brother-in-law and producer Vic is tuning in, as is Morty, which is, of course, my favorite fur nephew. That's my sister's dog. J-Mac 892. How you doing, partner? And Howard Blank tuning in via LinkedIn, retired NYPD Taru detective. Tune in from Key West, Florida. He's in Key West, Florida. Well, I hope you're enjoying the weather, Howard. Howard will be on the show in October, so stay tuned for that particular interview. Great time covering things with Chief Mueller. And we will briefly momentarily get into his time currently as the chief of the MTA Police, which, as I mentioned at the top, is multi-state. Like the Port Authority Police is in charge of New York and New Jersey, the MTA Police covers both New York, certain portions of New York, and Connecticut too. There's a train station about 5 to 10 minutes from where I live here in New Haven. I see them all the time. So it's very interesting what they do. They do have their own emergency service unit. They do have their own canine patrol, regular patrol. It's a really, really good agency that currently in New York, I don't know how it works for Connecticut. Chief Mueller can explain that momentarily. He's right. They still send those officers to the NYPD's academy to get their training in. And I believe their STS is also done at Floyd Bennett Field, where the NYPD trains their emergency service unit members, which Chief Mueller can also dive into momentarily. And he's back now, of course, as you were saying regarding 2020.
Yeah, so we were talking about the pandemic, and like you said, it was scary for everybody. Just no one knew what to expect. I say when I meet 3 and 4 year cops, I'm like, if you're ever in a bar and you have some, salty 30-year-old guy say, kid, you have no idea what it's like. After 2020 and 2021, that 4 year cop has seen as much as anybody's seen, because this was absolutely surreal. But, in Yonkers, we were lucky. Like, we started doing things creatively. Like, for example, we started heat mapping where the infections were occurring, and we were sharing that with our officers and everything to be careful. We worked with the PBA. If you remember, there was an initial 14-day quarantine, and we were losing officers like crazy that were getting infected. And obviously there was a lot of fear. So we went to one-man cars, so officers could ride by themselves, and they would just respond to a call. Like in Yonkers, it's two-man cars, with the exception of a few sectors on the east side of Yonkers. And so they would go in 2 different cars and respond to the same incident. We sat down with the PBA, which I don't know how we did it, and we did it fast. We were losing so many officers that we said, how about we get a new chart, and we just, forget about the contract for now. We empty everybody out of all the specialized units, whether it be traffic, whether it be detectives, crime scene unit, whatever it is. We need all hands on deck. We had enough officers to do where they would be on 2 days, 2 12-hour days, and off 6 days. So if you do the math, you got 2, 6, 2, 6. That's 14 days. So if someone did get infected, and thank God they didn't get seriously ill, they'd be back we'd only lose them for 2 days. So it really brought everybody together because it was working very hard. And we also got creative because there was a lot of fighting at the time about mask mandates, and you must wear a mask, and they wanted the police to be at the forefront of that. I didn't agree with it. I was very fortunate. I had a fantastic boss in Mayor Mike Spano, who always listens. You could explain to him what you thought. So we found a way to get what was needed rather than write people summonses for masks, not wearing masks. We would, and if you remember, Mike, there was a lot of pressure to do that.
Yeah.
We got card stock, and the card stock had English and Spanish, and it would say, why you should wear a mask. I'm sure that there's science now that say something different. Not going to get into that, but we would just hand the card stock. So we were out there talking to people, but not doing it in a way where they were already angry with us, especially after, the civil unrest. It's like, we're already having a hard time here doing anything, and now you want us to be the mask police. Very, very, very challenging time. But like I said, having a mayor, having the PBA, having the staff that we had, we got through it. We really did.
And to Mike Spano, his wife, of course, for those of you that don't know, is Mary Calvi, who's a longtime anchor on WCBS in New York City, who I may or may not be trying to get on this show. So, Mike, if you happen to watch this episode, please tell your wife to come on the show, because I very much like to interview her. And she does great work. She's been at WCBS, I believe, since 2002, so 21 years, and she's had a great career. But that brings us to 2022. Then we'll get into the MTA Police. Now, before that, in June, there was first April, in which after 28 years and really an amazing ascent, an amazing journey, you retired as commissioner of the department. Was there a moment, even without the pandemic, let's say that didn't happen, you didn't have 2020 and 2021, was there a moment where you started to think it might be time to walk away?
Yeah, I mean, it was funny. It was hard. Those couple of years were it was just a fast forward to just a lot of, stuff that we hadn't been through. It was a really trying time, and it wasn't just a trying time for me. It a trying time for the entire department, the entire community, the entire country, for that matter. But it was one of these things where at the time, I love working for the mayor. He was fantastic. It didn't appear that he was going to run for an additional term, so I had to start thinking about what do I want to do with the rest of my life. So it was interesting how it came about. I said to my wife, I said, I've never interviewed really for a job. So a headhunter had reached out to me, an executive search committee had reached out to me and said, are you interested in applying for the MTA job? I did not think I was going to get the job, Mike. I wasn't really thinking about leaving Yonkers, but I said, you know what, let me just do it for the practice to understand like what it is like when you're going outside. When you're in the same police department for 28 years, it's not the same as going to an outside entity and interviewing. So I figured, let me try it. I think I went to like 6 interviews, and all I would get after was, well, you didn't get eliminated. So you didn't get eliminated. You get eliminated. And, from there, finally they're like, you got the job. And then I had to go in and talk to the mayor and explain it to him. He, as always, for all his employees, he's extremely supportive, extremely understanding. And we made this transition. I took about a couple of month break just as they were processing everything in Yonkers, in the MTA for me. Got a little time to just relax a little bit. But, I think it was time. I think it was 28 years, a long time in one place.
Oh yeah. And you earned it. Now, as you were plugging the laptop in, I was saying this to the audience, and that the MTA Police and the Port Authority Police are alike in the sense that they don't just cover one state, they cover 2. Port Authority Police covers New York and New Jersey. MTA Police covers New York and Connecticut. So that's unique in that you're trying to understand. I mean, some laws are federal, so that's easy. It's a blanket cover across all 50 states. Some laws are different in that they're local. So how things might be done in New York, and rather it be the city or other portions that you guys cover, might differ from how it's done in Connecticut. So that particular adjustment in terms of how to deploy personnel across 2 states and how to operate within the legal confines of both states. Tell me about that. Is it harder or is it easier?
It's a big challenge. I mean, it's as you say, the laws are different, but there's also police standards that are different. The training is different. The accreditation requirements for Connecticut versus New York State are different. Jurisdictional boundaries different. Just simply the way they do business. But the MTA in general, under the leadership, another great boss that I have in Jana Lieber, the chairman. They've been doing this for a long time. Having Connecticut in the fold and having New York State. I mean, the entire footprint for the MTA system is 5,000 square miles. It's enormous. You think you go all the way out to Montauk, you go all the way up to Beacon, and then you go all the way out to New Haven. And there's multiple lines of track. I mean, it's just an absolutely immense system. I think we have probably close to 70,000 employees in the MTA larger, moving millions and millions of people every day, obviously because the New York City subway system and the busing system comes under the MTA purview. So it's a massive operation. They do really, really well with it. It's really an interesting job. Something totally foreign to me. Municipal policing and transit policing are very different.
I can imagine. Bill Bratton talked about it, right? When he became chief of the old transit police, pre-merged with the NYPD. Yeah, 4 million people taking that subway every single day, at least at that time. And it's the same thing. We got people like me that are moving around quite a bit on the trains. I go back and forth from here to New Haven to New York City quite a bit. You have others that are doing the same thing. And it's difficult in the sense that at least in one community, we talked about it earlier, right? The same people are committing the crimes. It's not often that your criminals are, no pun intended, in transit to where they might do something in New York, then they go to Connecticut. How do you find them? How do you coordinate with local police departments over there to get them? So on and so forth. But you always talk about, at least at this point in the interview, having a great team. And I imagine having that team under you that's been through this before, that has the experience, makes that process a lot easier. And it allows you to maintain relationships not only within the MTA police, but also those other police agencies I just mentioned too.
They've been wonderful. I mean, we have a great team in place. We've brought a couple of really brilliant people on recently. But what I say to the existing team that was here before I got here, I'm like, you guys will forget more about rail policing than I'll ever know. So it's very important for you guys to educate me every single day. Show me, train me, teach me. I don't know. It's a totally different type of policing. Like I said, the community, the ridership is our community, but as you say, they're in transit, and we try to use the moniker that our fellow MTA staff, conductors, engineer, that's our platinum client. We want to make sure they're safe. They feel good about us when we're there. We're where we need to be in Grand Central and Penn, on both commuter railroads and the Long Island Railroad and the Metro North. Our ridership obviously are everything, and we want to make sure they feel comfortable and safe when they're using the system. And when we think that we do, the MTA does a great job with analytics. I mean, they're just second to none when it comes to analytics. A large reason from my boss, Pat Warren, brilliant guy, great boss, West Point graduate, understands analytics extremely well, and we've been able to leverage that. Even like things like customer surveys, it doesn't all have to be just crime and quality of life complaints. It can be how customers feel, like if they're, why are they feeling more safe on the New Haven line than they are on the Harlem line? And then the question is, let's start narrowing that prism. Let's dial that in and say, well, the Hudson line's a lot bigger than, there's a lot of mileage on the Hudson line. So is it Northern Hudson line? Is it Central Hudson line? Is it closer to New York City? And we're starting to dial in on those things to be where we need to be when we need to be there.
Quick question before I get to the rapid fire, and it's been a tremendous conversation. As you know, I'm a huge ESU buff, and I know that your emergency service unit goes through the NYPD's STS down at Floyd Bennett Field. So again, talking about that interstate disbursement of ESU personnel, I know ESU's academy is accredited with New York State. So when you have emergency service personnel like that and transferring some personnel here to cover any of the subway systems we have in Connecticut, how does that process work? How does that accreditation come over here?
We work very closely with Connecticut. There are things that they will accept. There are things they won't. So we have to make sure that we're certified there. There are certain certifications. With ESU, I got to say right off the bat, I'm not entirely sure. We have recently expanded. Not only do we now send them to the NYPD, but Pat Ryder from Nassau County Police Department Commissioner has been very gracious. We just had 4 ESU officers graduate from the Nassau County ESU school. And, for us, this is a big thing because you spend all those months of this very technical special training that our ESU officers do. And now they go through a class with all these other guys that they may end up seeing out there. If a train flips over out in Queens, they're going to be working with the NYPD ESU. If a train flips over in Yonkers, they're going to be working with Yonkers ESU. And same goes for Nassau and Suffolk and everywhere else. So it's great that we're now dispersing, how we train our people to these different areas and jurisdictions, because it's just building those relationships where they have a better familiarity of working together.
It's a continuation of something about 30 years ago. I go back to the show Cops. There's an episode where they had the New York City Transit Police on it, 1994. And in one section, their ESU, what they called the Emergency Medical Rescue Unit, was dispatched to a man under. At that man under job was Transit's Emergency Rescue Unit. You had the NYPD Emergency Service Unit, and you had the Housing Police Emergency Rescue Unit, all working that job as a collective team. It didn't matter what patch they had on. They were all assisting with the train lift and respectfully getting this man's deceased body out of there. So same thing now, man under jobs, any kind of job. They're all there. Same thing down here in Connecticut. We don't have ESUs down here, at least full time. But, coordination with the fire department is just as important too, whatever fire department that might be. And it continues to play into what this conversation to this point has always been about: effective communication.
Yeah. I mean, and it's one of those things where the MTA and most transit police departments are absolutely dependent on the local jurisdictions. You're going to want to have a super solid relationship. You do that through communication. You do that through constant networking. But you also do it by saying, like, there are things we can offer you. Like, we would never turn someone down. Maybe, like you said, in Connecticut, if there's a need for an ESU truck and our truck is there and can get there quickly, we're going. And the same thing with NYPD, same thing with Nassau, same thing with Yonkers. We are looking to build a robust drone program. And the drone program, we're going to operate it, we'll run it. But that doesn't mean if there's a need for a drone in a local municipality along our rails that we're not going to have that available for them. The same thing goes for our canine unit. We have, 30 canines. And, we're going to, they're available for everybody, and that's one of the great things about policing. We all help each other, state police, local, everybody.
Absolutely. Always about teamwork. And on that note, we can end as we always end, and that is with the rapid fire. 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 hit and run answers from you. You can say pass if you want. Are you ready?
Go ahead.
All right. So first, funniest call you ever responded to?
There's so many of them. It's hard to say, but I will tell you this. It's more about the guys and what happens after. And there was one particular call during a snowstorm where there was like 10 cops at this job. The job ended. Someone ended up throwing a snowball, and then everyone just got involved in a giant snowball fight in the middle of the street. And it was like 3:00 in the morning. Like, those are moments you just can't. They're just fantastic.
Well, of course, can't beat it. Second, most uplifting call you ever responded to?
I think that was, some of the life-saving stuff we do, where like, a baby gets delivered or you get someone to the hospital and then you find out later that they made it because you got them there quick. You threw someone in the backseat of your car and you didn't wait for the ambulance. You took a chance. Probably the most recent uplifting call was when one of my officers was shot. It was just the most uplifting that he survived and he was okay because he went down. He's a good friend of mine. And, his brother was at the scene. They got him in the car. They got him to Jacoby, and they saved his life. That was right before I left. So that was probably the most uplifting that he survived.
Yeah, I think I do remember that incident. So, yes, we're very glad he survived. Third, thing that after all these years on the job between the NYPD, the Yonkers Police Department, currently the MTA Police, you still love. It still gets your blood pumping.
People. Just people. It's cops. It's community. It's just I'm a people person, and I love talking to people. I love solving problems. Whether you're at one individual call with your partner and you're trying to figure out which way to go with it and what to do, or you're developing department-wide strategy on a major scale, it's just that Rubik's Cube. It's either a Rubik's Cube or a chessboard, one or the other. And I love the problem-solving aspect, the critical thinking of it, of how we solve problems. And it's very gratifying when we see crime go down. And it's very gratifying when the community is very happy with, with how we're doing it. Like I said, it's great to lower crime. It's great to make the community safe, but you're not at the policing state of grace unless you can keep them safe and have them feel safe in how you're doing it.
True. Absolutely. Couldn't have said it any better myself. Fourth, favorite bar or restaurant in Yonkers?
That's a hard one. We have some great restaurants, and I would say you got to break down bar versus restaurant, but I will tell you, I got to say Carlo's on Tuckahoe Road is number one. I loved Julio's when it was open. I loved Silvio's when it was open. But I would say right now, Carlo's is the king.
There you go. I'll have to check it out if I'm ever in Yonkers. Hi, Maui Swift and Willie D in the chat, by the way. See you guys both, and I appreciate you guys tuning in. And fifth and finally, knowing what you know now, right, over 3 decades of police experience, if you can go back in time as the current version of yourself and give advice to a younger version of yourself, what would this John Mueller tell a younger John Mueller?
I would say enjoy the moments because they are very quick and they go fast. I don't know where the 30 years went. It's just like a blink of an eye. And you sometimes you get stuck in time and you feel like, my God, it goes so fast. Everyone told me that. Everyone warned me of that. And I would warn the younger version of myself, like, you better embrace it because within a blink of an eye, it's done.
There you go. Good advice. Good advice. Stick around. We'll say our goodbyes off the air. Before I say goodbye to the audience, any shout outs to anyone or anything that you'd like to give?
No, just a shout out to all my MTA PD people. They are absolutely fantastic. We are building something very special as a team. Very grateful to the MTA itself because they are fantastic as far as supporting us. You don't get to be a good police department, a good public safety organization without the support of the MTA or Mayor Spano in Yonkers or the city council in Yonkers. You cannot have one without the other. So I've been blessed that way, and I give them a shout out. Also to my family for putting up with it. I got 3 beautiful kids, married for almost 30 years. I'm very grateful for my family for supporting me through this. Getting to see, now I have kids that are older than some of the kids that come on the job. So that's interesting too.
There you go. My shout outs to James Sheehan for putting us in touch. James will be on the show next month. Good man.
And I will be seeing Jimmy next Tuesday. We're going for lunch, but I'll tell you, I'll give your viewership a little bit about Jimmy. Jimmy is, and he's not going to handle this well. He's a brilliant mind. I got to get close with him at the Naval Academy, the Center for Homeland Defense and Security in Monterey, California, where we spent 4 weeks together, over the period of a year. just, learning from each other. Jimmy was the light of the actual class. He's just a brilliant mind, not afraid to speak his mind, very thoughtful. Just someone you can really, I learned a ton from.
Absolutely, and I'm sure I'll learn a lot when he comes on next month. Chief, this was great. Like I said, stick around. We'll say our goodbyes off the air. Coming up next on the Mike the New Haven podcast, it's going to be volume 42 of the Best of the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. 33 years in the New York City Fire Department, 14 of them as a chief in Division 7, I believe, in the Bronx. And he'll tell me all about it. Tom Dunn will join me for volume 42, like I said, of the Best of the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. Don't miss it this Tuesday, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And shout out to everybody that tuned in tonight, collectively, YouTube, LinkedIn, those of you that watched this on Twitter, those of you that will watch this later and listen to it later. Appreciate every single one of you, and I'll see you this upcoming Tuesday, like I said, for the Best of the Bravest, volume 42, retired FDNY Deputy Chief Tom Dunn. In the meantime, on behalf of current MTA Police Chief John Mueller, this has been volume 2 of the Beat, Profiles of Police Nationwide. I am Mike Colón. We will see you next time, and have a great rest of your weekend. Take care.